So I want to congratulate you on getting to the last panel, which we're about to start. It should be very exciting. The panel is, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Eric. The last one is Who Needs Anti-Semitism by Ruth Wisse. I want to introduce the moderator of tonight's panel, Batya Ungar-Sargon. Batya is an award-winning journalist and opinion editor for The Forward. She's written a ton on anti-Semitism and Jewish issues for The Forward and other publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and Foreign Policy. She's a voice I always go to when I need to know what's happening in the Jewish world. So, thank you, Batya, and we are set, and welcome. And I'm going to let Batya introduce the panel. Thanks very much.
Welcome to the Hannah Arendt Center Conference on Racism and Anti-Semitism, to the panel, Who Needs Anti-Semitism? I want to thank Roger and Tina. This conference is already so incredible. I truly feel like I'm in the presence of greatness. The speakers have been incredible, and I've already learned so much, and I hope you're all enjoying it as well. I'm really honored and humbled to be chairing this panel. I'm going to start by introducing our speaker, Professor Ruth Wisse, and my fellow co-chair, Shani Moore. Then Professor Wisse will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and after that, Shani and I will each pose a question or two to Professor Wisse for discussion, and then I'm going to open it up to your questions. And of course, if there are students, please, we want to prioritize your questions. Professor Wisse is currently the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Tikva Fund and the Martin Perez Professor of Yiddish Literature and Comparative Literature Emerita at Harvard University. Wisse won a National Humanities Medal in 2007 and is a frequent contributor to Commentary Magazine, Mosaic Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. Professor Wisse is known for the power of her scholarship, the fierceness of her intellect, and the unapologetic nature of her politics. She is described by her students as the kindest of teachers and the fiercest of advocates. Her books include The Schlemiel as Modern Hero, If I Am Not for Myself, The Modern Jewish Canon, Jews and Power, and No Joke, Making Jewish Humor. Shani Moore is an associate fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College and a research fellow at the Chaikin Center for Geostrategy at the University of Haifa. He served as a director for foreign policies on the Israeli National Security Council. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wisse.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Roger, and thank you for the organizers of this conference. Perfect. Anything's good, sure. I wrote out my comments because I tend to trust myself too little these days. So, in the summer of 1992, the New York Times devoted its entire op-ed page to an article by Henry Louis Gates entitled Black Demagogues and Pseudo-Scholars, warning that while anti-Semitism in America was generally on the wane, this is 1992, it was on the rise among Black Americans, with Blacks twice as likely as whites to hold anti-Semitic views. Moreover, research showed that anti-Semitism was most pronounced, quote, among the younger and more educated Blacks. Gates was writing then as the newly appointed chair of Harvard's Department of Afro-American Studies, and as such, he was in a position to know and to feel concerned. And since I had just accepted and was about to begin a tenured position at Harvard, I paid close attention to this article. I knew that earlier that year, Harvard's Black Student Association had hosted Leonard Jeffries, professor of Black Studies at City College, who used the platform to denounce Jews for running the slave trade and to contrast the frigid whites of the world with the sun-warmed Blacks. Also speaking at Harvard, Conrad Mohammed of the Nation of Islam had blamed the Jews for despoiling the environment and destroying the ozone layer. I think we're going to get a demonstration of what Henry Louis Gates was talking about. So Gates cited these and other crackpot theories being peddled in black academic circles about Jews descending from brutish Neanderthals. And of course, he cited the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that accused Jews of plotting to take over the globe. Make no mistake, he said, this is anti-Semitism from the top down, engineered and promoted by leaders who affect to be speaking for a larger resentment. I see that you're all fascinated by anti-Semitism in its present tense, and we are delighted to have a demonstration of what I am speaking about right here. Thank you so much for being the objects of this talk. There is no clearer thing that I can think of than to have a visual sign of the times. In any case, those of you who can hear me, Gates's account of black anti-Semitism included the reluctance to confront it. It is something most of us, as if by unstated agreement, chose not to talk about. There might be good reason for this, he said, since black America was still beleaguered, but one dared not ignore or minimize the problem because blacks could hardly defeat racism if they practiced it themselves. And he wrote, "The moral credibility of our struggle against racism hangs in the balance." Gates may have been worried lest these spokesmen spoil the reputation of Afro-American studies in its infancy. But he was all... Are you all going to do this? Excuse me. Are you all going to do this? People, are you all going to do this? Interrupt us? You are supposed to be students at a university? Shame on you.
Equality is not shouting down someone who is different. It's opening your ears and listening. Shut up!
Okay. We were told that we would be able to have this panel without anti-Semitism being manifest. Is this the case or is it not? Well, then I would ask these people to please be polite and remove themselves. They shall be removed. They shall be removed, just like a log that's floating down the waters. They shall be removed.
We will ask them to move to the side with the sign.
No, I think they should leave. And so let me leave this aside and let me just tell you that what the greatest problem we have on campuses today is the organization of politics against the Jews. And one of the reasons for this is because other forms of racism, you see? I can do almost anything. Are you? Would? Shall I continue? All right. Okay. Well, what I found most impressive about the candor of this piece, even more impressive than that, was the analysis itself. I was by then thinking and writing a lot about anti-Semitism, frustrated by the way it was usually treated and talked about. The great historian, my teacher, Salo Baron, had called anti-Semitism the dislike of the unlike. That sounds reasonable until you realize that the definition applies to all forms of prejudice. And then the foremost historian of anti-Semitism, Robert Wistrich, called it the oldest hatred, which didn't satisfy me either, because while anti-Semitism draws from earlier demonic images of the Jews, it's an instrument of modern politics, different in kind and requiring its own inquiry. I was especially troubled by the way Holocaust and Holocaust studies conflated anti-Semitism with Nazism. Hitler's war to eliminate the Jews was indeed the greatest enormity the modern world had yet experienced. But anti-Semitism was not confined to fascism or to Germany. It started on the left before it moved to the right. It appealed to internationalists at least as much as to nationalists. It excited secular and religious alike. It was non-denominational, egalitarian. Anti-Jewishness had to be understood through its political functions, which was exactly how Gates treated it in this op-ed. He did a far better job than the Anti-Defamation League. So I commend this article to you for your reading, July 20th, 1992, New York Times. But since Black anti-Semitism is not my main subject here, I want to extrapolate from this analysis what it has to say about the generic features of anti-Semitism, what it is, how it works, and why it remains the world's most successful political tool. The article describes the power struggle within the Black community between, on the one side, those like Martin Luther King, who wanted to normalize Black politics by making common cause with fellow Americans, and on the other, leaders increasingly linked to Muslim militants who were using Jew blame to gain adherents and resorting to classic anti-Jewish tactics for, quote, a barricaded withdrawal into racial authenticity. And this is a quote from Gates's article. The strategy of these apostles of hate, I believe, is best understood as ethnic isolationism. They know that the more isolated Black America becomes, the greater their power. And what's the most efficient way to begin to sever Black America from its allies? Bash the Jews. These demagogues apparently calculate, and you're halfway there. End of quote. Gates was making the case in favor of liberal civil rights legislation, which ended segregation and banned discrimination in employment and voting in order to ensure equal opportunity irrespective of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This was meant to consolidate what would be painstaking, imperfect, but incremental approach of the constitutional democracy against, on the one hand, anti-Black racism, which persisted despite the laws against it, and on the other, the demagogues and ethnic isolationists who wanted political leverage through Black power and used reverse racial bias to gain it. The article warned that if Black intellectuals failed to rally against this bigotry, they would be complicit in what cannot be condoned. Now, what about the Jews? How did Gates think they figured in this? He writes, the Jews could not understand how their political commitment to the civil rights struggle and the historic Black-Jewish alliance could have led to this situation. He quotes the aphorism, "We can rarely forgive those who helped us," and says that the brutal truth is that the new anti-Semitism arises not in spite of the Black-Jewish alliance, but because of it. For precisely such transracial cooperation, epitomized by the historic partnership between Blacks and Jews, is what poses the greatest threat for the isolationist movement. In other words, the Jews' liberal drive for equal opportunity and an end to discrimination stands in the way of grievance politics that wants equal outcome, restitution, political power. The Jews are accused of wanting tolerance only so that they should be able to dominate. In conclusion, the article warns against bigotry as an opportunistic infection, attacking most virulently where the body politic is in a weakened state. It quotes Dr. King, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Black anti-Semitism weakens the body politic even further when it replaces one form of racism by another." Now, although this article is framed in moral terms, I prefer to discuss the problem it raises on political terms that are by no means limited to sections of Black America. Odd as it may seem, anti-Semitism is one of the most influential ideologies or political strategies of modern times. It's a politics of grievance that builds its political base by blaming others, in this case the Jews, and explaining problems as the fault of the Jews. In a healthy world and a healthy democracy, liberal and conservative parties struggle for power, with the balance moving back and forth between them. You know how it is here. One party may favor strong central government, the other greater decentralization, and so on. But in any case, vying parties in this country realize that all solutions and resolutions must be reached between them. Anti-Semitism blames others for the real problems that it faces. We may think of it as the politics of the pointing finger, pointing at Jewish exploiters, Jewish landlords, Jewish communists, Jewish capitalists, Jewish occupiers, Zionist racists, the 1%. Whereas other ideologies have to offer constructive programs, anti-Semitism has the advantage of being wholly against. But since problems are real and the Jews are not their solution, anti-Semitism misdirects awareness and worsens the situation into spiraling discontent. So I think the appeal of anti-Semitism is best understood through its political functions. Forged in Germany in the last third of the 19th century, it arose just as the op-ed describes, in a political struggle between advocates and opponents of emancipation. Liberals were promising an open democratic society with greater opportunity for all, but many people feared and felt threatened by a level playing field that would be competitive as well as liberating. In the 1870s, Wilhelm Marr founded the movement for anti-Semitism in Germany, calling liberal democracy a ploy by the Jews to take over the country, the media, the law courts, medicine, culture, the economy. Instead of campaigning outright against liberal democracy, he campaigned against the Jews as its secret beneficiaries. Call it German or Aryan isolationism. It was a brilliant strategy. And I think that we are remiss if we do not acknowledge anti-Semitism is a brilliant strategy. It could not have been so successful to this very day if it were not. And look why. Look at the political advantages that it offers in a popular struggle for popular opinion. One, it builds coalitions among otherwise contentious groups. In Europe, it rallied conservatives who believed that the Jews were undermining traditional authority, radicals who accused Jewish capitalists and bankers of exploiting workers and the economy, extreme nationalists who said Jews were aliens corrupting the language and culture, and internationalists who said that Jews were a racist tribal throwback. Instead of attacking liberalism outright, anti-Semitism seemed to attack only the Jews, in this case, only Israel, which made liberals themselves notoriously reluctant to confront it. Some said, maybe there's truth in the charge. And most just tried to ignore it. I think that's human nature. Although Marr was sincere in claiming that he was not a Christian who blamed Jews for killing of Christ, he drew on centuries of demonization that had made Jews a plausible culprit, a small people with a hugely inflated negative image. So the movement grew and gained strength, other ones of its functions. Anti-Semitism offered a neat explanation and solution for whatever was going wrong. If Jews were to blame for the crises, one had only to suppress or rid oneself of the Jews. Also, it redirected dissatisfaction away from deep and in some cases intractable problems toward one villainous element whose removal would seem to make more room for others. It offered an outlet for violence for those who needed it against Jews from whom there was always something to steal. And best of all, it was directed against a people with no incentive for counter-aggression, who needed acceptance from precisely those who organized against them. The decisive moment in this movement came when politicians were elected on a platform of anti-Semitism, which began to happen at the end of the 19th century. Here was an anti-democratic movement that successfully harnessed the democratic process to gain power. May I add to all these functions of anti-Semitism, it is such fun. Have you noticed? Anti-Semitism is such fun because the Jews don't fight back. And you don't have to be afraid of attacking the Jews. On this campus, for example, I'd like to see someone saying, you know, the blacks should go back to slavery. How many people do you see going that? But no, to say that Israel has to go back to slavery, to undoing itself as a state, hey, you can get away with that. Fun. This is fun. So, by 1933, Hitler had taken over the government of Germany, and other anti-Semitic parties were prominent in countries from France to Poland and Romania. But of course, that was only half its success. A parallel form of anti-Semitism took hold in the socialist and communist camp that opposed religion, nationalism, and commerce, and cast the Jews as the foul combination of all three. The Soviet Union condemned discrimination directed against Jews as individuals while outlawing Judaism, Jewish peoplehood, and Zionism, which is the right of Jews to their homeland. This ultimately proved the more threatening form of anti-Jewish politics, because whereas racial anti-Semitism explicitly excludes the Jews and leaves them no choice but to oppose it, the internationalist socialist form of anti-Semitism attracts many Jews under the banner of universalism, secularism, and repairing the world. So in 1929, Stalin welcomed the Muslim Brotherhood's attacks on the Jews in Palestine as the beginning of an Arab revolution and framed all the anti-Zionist slogans against Jewish imperialism and colonialism that are used today. Hitler condemned Jews as both communists and capitalists. Stalin condemned them as both nationalists and cosmopolitans. So you see here the amazing protean force of this simple political tool. So from what I've said, you can see how seamlessly this political strategy moved from Europe to the Middle East. Since 1945, when the Allies won the war against Nazism, the generative force of anti-Semitism has been Arab and Muslim rather than European and post-Christian. In 1945, the Arab League coalesced against one unifying pan-Arab goal: the prevention of a Jewish homeland, and when that failed, the destruction of that homeland. Originally directed against the Jews in other people's lands, anti-Jewish politics was now directed against the Jews in their own land. And rather than cleansing Jews from other countries, Jews were now to be removed from their homeland on the grounds that the land itself belonged to another people. The demographic and political asymmetry between anti-Jews and Jews was even greater in the Middle East than it had been in Europe, which meant that this was the war that the Arabs might not win, but they could never lose. It grew even more lopsided when the fall of the Shah in Iran brought to power the theocratic Islamic Republic that conducts what it considers a holy war against the Jews. So the Latin phrase cui bono asks for whose good, applying the principle of utility to estimate the value of an act or policy. Applying the functions of anti-Jewish politics I enumerated above to Arab and Muslim leaders, you see how useful they have been in forming otherwise improbable coalitions of blame, redirecting dissatisfaction from internal problems to this foreign outpost of the West, providing an outlet for violence, from the Palestinian pogroms in Palestine of the 1920s to Iran's support for Hezbollah and Hamas. Anti-Israel ideology originally used the language of the right. We will drive the Jews into the sea. Until 1975, having failed to destroy Israel in the wars of 67 and 73, Arab leaders joined the Soviet bloc to pass United Nations Resolution 3379, defining Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. So, those who denied Jews the homeland, their homeland, claimed that the Jews were denying Arabs their homeland. They had not opposed Israel for displacing Palestinian Arabs. They opposed partition in order to keep Palestinians homeless as the perpetual battering ram and justification for their aggression. The Arab-Soviet switch of political terminology from the right to the left was the defining adaptation that reignited anti-Semitism for the 21st century. Anti-Semitism in its older xenophobic form could not have penetrated the American academic and cultural elites from the right, but it had no trouble penetrating it from the left, adopting the Palestinian as poster child for the intersectional coalitions of victimhood. So I wrote about 10 conclusions to this compressed discussion, trying to clarify what the title of this conference might otherwise obscure. The yoking of racism and anti-Semitism can be important only if we distinguish one from the other. Anti-Semitism is not another form of hatred or prejudice or even racism, but it is the organization of politics against the Jews that is aimed at what they represent. This ideology and movement is not about the Jews, but about what its adherents want to prevent or destroy. And it is always about the destruction of something, whether it is against liberal democracy, guarantees of equal opportunity, regional coexistence, Western civilization, or American exceptionalism, or the right of speakers to come and address an audience believing that they have the right to do so. Whether it's against any of these, the Jews and Israel always stand for something much larger than themselves. To know what is going on, we have to look at what anti-Semitism is trying to deflect attention from, whom it is trying to attract, how and why it is spreading. We must never follow the pointing finger. The Jews are never the actual problem, and their disappearance can never solve it. Anti-Semitism simply needs them as its foil. So let me end. Right now, for what I believe is the very first time in American politics, anti-Semitism has penetrated the United States Congress, and its adherents are now electable on platforms that include anti-Semitism. They support a coalition of grievance minorities that want, through identity politics, to change the system into one-party rule of the allegedly oppressed. Several newly elected representatives see nothing wrong with promoting Arab-Muslim war against Israel as a legitimate rallying call to their fellow Muslims in their districts. And Columbia University sees nothing wrong with inviting the president of Malaysia to address nothing less than the World Leaders Forum. Henry Louis Gates, a lovely man, would never again write anything like this article because the identity politics that he deplored turned respectable, And what he was once afraid might discredit Afro-American studies now underwrites these studies. And if it includes anti-Semitism, tant pis, as we used to say in Quebec. Too bad, tough. The politics of grievance has taken over the university, much of the media and popular culture, and a huge swath of the Democratic Party, and it is beginning to make a comeback on the other side of the political spectrum in the form of white grievance as well. Its target is the American polity that Martin Luther King aspired to and that many of us are determined to keep supporting and working to improve. I would just, as one word, democracy is not biologically transmitted. It is a recent and difficult political formulation that the United States has developed to a very high level, but it is under serious attack, and the spread of anti-Semitism is putting it to the test. As for the Jews, in the same decade that the Germans and their profiteers murdered 1/3 of the Jewish people, other parts of that same people had begun the recovery of their homeland that had lain under foreign occupation for 2,000 years, serially occupied by Romans, Christians, Muslims, Ottomans, and British. The land of Israel is now the state of Israel. I consider this a human miracle greater than any of those registered in the Bible, and a testament to what a slave people can achieve. So American Jews put great emphasis on educating their fellow Americans about the Holocaust. I have always considered this a political error. What we ought to have emphasized is the power of self-reliance, self-accountability, self-improvement, the foundational beliefs of the United States as well as of the Jewish people. And perhaps that may be the subject of the next conference at this center. Thank you.
Woo. Thank you so much. I'm so glad our protesters had to hear that. Okay, so I have 2 questions for you, and then I'm going to pass it over to Shani, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. All right, my first question is, in the wake of the Pittsburgh Tree of Life massacre, in which 11 holy Jews were murdered while at prayer, you wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in which you called it politically comforting to cast the murderer Robert Bowers as a neo-Nazi. You write that a single shooter wants to kill the Jews is less dangerous to this country than Louis Farrakhan's smiling designation of Jews as termites, broadcast to a vast audience, or the vicious movement to boycott Israel. My question is, in casting the BDS movement,
You have to leave now. You violated the college's code. You have to leave.
My homeland is Jersey.
You're not in Jersey, buddy.
can you wait a second? Can I just finish that?
Yeah, I think mine does.
All right, Bache, please continue. I'm
Can I-
sorry about that.
That's okay. You ready?
I don't know if my mic works.
I'll pass you mine. Okay, are we ready? Okay. My question, which the protesters would have loved, is in casting the BDS movement to boycott Israel and explicitly...
Oh, for goodness sake, there's another demonstration.
No, he's a part of the conference. He
is?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Looked very neat.
In casting the BDS movement to boycott Israel, an explicitly nonviolent movement that many West Bank Palestinians credit with the radical drop in terror attacks against Israelis, in casting this nonviolent movement as more dangerous than actual murder, Aren't you, in a way, with all due respect, devaluing human life in suggesting that a political movement you don't like or that offends you is worse than murder? Doesn't that erase the difference between politics and violence? Isn't that something of an insult to the dead?
Well, it's an interesting. I wasn't
Didn't see that
minimizing.
coming.
Believe me, my daughter lives in Pittsburgh with our 4 grandchildren of my daughters. I do not minimize the shooting of people in a synagogue. By the way, they are synagogue goers. That's not the point that I was making. I was making the point that lone shooters are a problem in this country. Mm-hmm. Lone shooters, if you've noticed, shoot. They shoot schools, they shoot from the top of buildings in Las Vegas. They are, of course, a problem. And of course, the few white supremacists that there are a real political problem. But what we're talking about here is a worldwide war against the Jewish people that is the most lopsided war in human history, by now one of the longest. The Arab world occupies 500 million miles, 5 million square miles, larger than the territory of the United States, and fights against a country of 11,000 square miles that it wants to annihilate. This is the world that we live in. And this is the movement that they are now spreading, that has re-entered the United States, that has re-entered Europe. This is a worldwide political movement that is meant to bring down governments. I don't see that in white supremacy here in the United States of America. And I think that Jews feel very comfortable fighting the war that was won in 1945, that they say that they thought that the Holocaust would make them immune to other attacks on the Jewish people. It hasn't been the case. So I think that one has to get serious here. By the way, the BDS movement began in 1945 because the Arab League, one of the first things that it did was to organize an economic boycott against Israel. And that the BDS movement is the direct result of the economic boycott that was originally launched by the Arab League. It's just an extension of that now in the modern world. And what is it meant to do? Is it really meant to limit Israeli economy? No. It's meant to do exactly what it did in this audience, to make Israel the subject. I am sure that on Bard campus, as on Harvard campus, there was not a protest against what was happening in Syria. No, not a tear shed for the thousands and thousands of Arab children who are being killed and massacred by fellow Arabs. No care for them. Why? Because the pointing finger points away from all those dysfunctional Arab worlds at Israel, 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 Israel. So that is the function of BDS. It's not even whether it's successful or not successful on a campus. It's just make Israel the subject. Keep it there. It is the villain. It is the villain. And I think that this is, as I say, the most brilliant political strategy of modern times.
So yes, of course.
Does this work?
Yeah. Yes.
Yo, I can be heard. Yeah, I don't want to give too much respect to the... Okay. I don't want to pay any unnecessary honors to the rather wretched spectacle that was here in front of us, but I think that the slogan that we heard at the end was deeply revealing. So there's concern here about a set of racial incidents in Simon's Rock and the classic, almost distilled essence of anti-Semitism as an organizing political principle, as a political ideology, and even as a theology, is that the problem of the day is encapsulated there. When you chant something like "From Simon's Rock to Palestine," you're essentially saying, oh yes, the explanation for my immediate problem here, for the evil I can identify, is, well, I'm not going to say with the Jews, I'm going to say with Israel. it's hilarious almost to deny the intellectual genealogy of that, because the power of that slogan is only there, its ability to influence us, its catchiness, its charisma is only there because we're all aware of that genealogy. Otherwise, it would just be an inane rhyme. I think that was accidentally, but rather fascinatingly, very revealing about this whole thing. And the other thing that would be very revealing, and perhaps Roger can interject here, is there have been a lot of controversial topics discussed today, and a lot of controversial topics discussed on this stage at all of these conferences every year. This only seems to happen with Jewish speakers. It only seems to happen with people who want to tie it into, it only seems to happen when people want to tie this into Israel. How about now? Okay. Sorry. How far back do I need to go in the...
The last sentence.
Right. There are a lot of controversial topics here discussed on this stage. There were quite a few very provocative things said today that were super interesting, but very provocative things that were said on this stage from morning until right up until the moment the three of us got on the stage. And there have been a number of controversial topics discussed at this annual conference. This spectacle that we saw, this only happens with Jews. It only happens under the cover of discussing Israel. Israel could be a horrible state and a horrible country, one of the worst. This should still raise some questions. This still, I think that I certainly, and Professor Wisse especially, who's been around for much longer than I have and has a much more interesting biography than I do, is entirely entitled to say, why is that? We're allowed to ask.
So my next question would be to that point. It seems to me that there's a difference between a politics that's organized around Jews, qua Jews, and a politics that's organized around a sovereign state that happens to be made up of Jews. I see why it would be tempting to see those as one and the same, why the obsession with Israel, and there's so many. But the fact is, Israel is a sovereign state that is committing human and civil rights abuses. So in a way, to me, isn't there a danger in treating that as the same as anti-Semitism that targets Jews who don't have an army specifically to protect them? Do you understand the question?
I do understand. I do understand the question, and it always comes back to the question of what, can't I criticize Israel? Of course, you know, this is the most, you're talking about the most self-critical people that ever was invented. So we criticize all the time, and there's plenty to criticize here and there and everywhere. This isn't criticism. This is blame. Israel is not being criticized, it's being blamed. It's being blamed for the problem and the suffering of the Palestinians. It's being blamed for the problem of the Arabs. It's being blamed for the problem that only the Arabs created and only the Arabs can solve. And the Jews do not bear, let me say, an iota of blame for any of the problems in the Arab world. The Arabs, no more than the Jews who were blamed for the problems of the Poles, that they were preventing the rise of the Polish middle class. Well, you know, there was more justice to that than there is to the fact that Jews are holding the Arabs back. What, the Arabs in Palestine and the rest of the West Bank could not have created a federation with Jordan, and they couldn't have become like the Jews, they couldn't have built orchestras. You know that the Palestinians are the second most literate people in the Arab world? How much do you see coming out of the Palestinian world? It's only because they blame and they blame and they blame.
Okay.
So, excuse me, no, so I think it is exactly the same thing as I said. Before, politics was organized against Jews in other people's lands because it's the function. You're not following what I'm saying. Look at the function of anti-Semitism. Why do the Arabs need it? Why do they use it? Why do these groups want it? I'll tell you why these groups want it. Do you know why these groups want it? Because you could not get up here in this auditorium, as I said before, and you could not be racially against blacks, gays, any other group, because you get sensitivity training for that. And you'd be thrown off the campus faster than you could say your name. But allowing it for the Jews, that is allowed. And Jews join in on it, and they say, of course. Well, if it's allowed, and if it's the only form of protest that is allowed, and the only form of violence that is allowed, and the only form of blame that is allowed, of course you're going to have it. And that's the simplest explanation politically. And of course it's aimed against Israel, because Israel is a Jewish state. The Jews are now in their country, so you attack them in their country. If they're in other people's countries, you attack them in other people's countries.
So I want to open it up to questions. Are there any students, first of all, any students who have a question? No, I want to restrict it to people in this room. Any student? Yes. Angela.
I'd like to ask why your conception of anti-Semitism is so
Sorry, where are you?
She's right back by the door, in front of the door.
Oh, okay. So thank you. Okay.
I'd like to ask why your concept of anti-Semitism is so inextricably linked to Palestine and Israel, given that it seems like a lot of your grievances with anti-Semitism have to do with cultural differences and not ethno-geographical states. Thank you.
Well, what I was trying to present is an answer to the question of how is it that anti-Semitism plays the part that it does in the world. There are now maybe 13 million Jews in the world, 5 million fewer than there were in 1939. Do you know how many other people there are in the world? Why does it play the role that it does in the United Nations? Why does it play this role on campuses? I mean, you need an answer for these questions. And you can't just say this is hatred or this is whatever it is. There has to be an answer. I will tell you how I come to think of it. You know, the AIDS epidemic swept this country. It was a very interesting thing. AIDS was a horrible disease. Nobody had really seen this before. Now, did they raise a museum to AIDS? No. Did they write the history of AIDS? No. What did they do? They went about looking at the variables, looking at why it worked, how it spread, because the idea was that they wanted to cure AIDS. Now, I want to cure anti-Semitism. So what I look at is why it works, how it works, where it works, whom it serves, where it surfaces. This is the way you start to analyze a question. And that's how I come to what I come to.
Anti-Semitism?
There is no other country around which a politics of an ideology of extermination is organized.
How do you blame a whole country for a problem that has existed long before the conflict of Israel and Palestine? Anti-Semitism goes back to centuries.
Yes,
you know?
it does. But anti-Semitism, as I said, the word itself, the movement itself, arose under very specific political conditions. It arose in Europe in tandem with the rise of democracy, if you believe it, because it's a way of rousing attracting political allegiance, attracting people who follow it. In
So
any
then you're
case,
blaming
I'll
Europe.
tell you, let me just answer more quickly. You know, I've written about this. If you're a thinking person, I have a book called Jews in Power. Read it, and I try to explain why the Jews serve this particular function, how they come to serve this particular function, and why it succeeds.
Any other students? Yes.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to clarify that people didn't just start it off wanting to fight AIDS. People called it the gay cancer for the longest time. And also, they were isolated from the entire community. If the gays didn't fight for the longest time, no one would have paid attention to even going on about to research it. And also, AIDS was killing people, like, directly. So I don't quite see the correlation here, but bringing it back to my question would probably be, I don't think anyone's blaming people who are people who are just trying to live, trying to make a living for themselves, where Palestinians once tried to cultivate the land, and now those land has turned into concrete, which is constructed by Israeli government. I think not a lot of people really love their government. I have friends from Israel, and they've personally expressed interest in learning about what their government is doing, and I think just to blame it entirely on the rest of the world, it's, to say the least, a very interesting statement. So my question would be, how do you define or how do you identify the anti-Semitism? Or you're just certainly not quite agreeing what a government is doing to a certain group of people who have lived on the same land, even coexisted together for the longest time together, and now one has just destroyed the other?
Sorry. I define anti-Semitism quite precisely as the organization of politics against the Jews. And that is my succinct definition of it. You can apply it and you can see, and what I tried to look at is its functionality. And as for, I don't know, there's a point in your question that I had wanted to address more specifically, but I guess it's late in the day.
Okay, if it comes to, let us know, and
will,
we'll find. Next question. Yes, young man. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's like, I can't. Sorry. Yeah.
Hello, I have 2 questions and 1 comment. I was wondering, you said earlier that you're keen to cure the world of anti-Semitism, which is very optimistic and interesting. Would that inquiry go on to include what's happening with Ethiopian Jews in Israel? Because as you know, I'm also a Semite. I'm non-Jewish, but I consider myself to be a Semite. And I know there's been an influx of Jews from Ethiopia over the past few decades to Israel. So I'd really be willing to get your perspective on what anti-Semitism means within the context, having heard you talk about, black anti-Semitism. What would that look like from your point of view in terms of how that would then address the crisis that we now see with the mistreatment of Ethiopian Jews in Israel, or at least that's how part of the media has portrayed it? That's one question. My second question, in your perspective as someone who's trying to fight anti-Semitism, does such an insight have scope to include any critique of the treatment of Palestinians by the Israeli government or not? And the third comment I'd like to make is you've made analogies that have been quite, I feel, simplistic. You've referred to perhaps we'd never go back to telling black people, go back to slavery. You've made analogies to AIDS. I think there's a danger in doing that because it's very essentialist, and I think it's important to dive deeper into the specificity of these phenomena, and I'm not condoning anti-Semitism, but I think it's wrong to make analogies that drive your argument and then almost undermine, different sort of stages in history that have led to the suffering of, say, blacks, or the AIDS crisis having been a stigma of, as the gentleman just said, a gay community. So I'm really throwing out 2 questions and making a comment. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate your comment very much. I especially appreciate what you say about differentiation, because this is a point that is very clear to me, so I would really not like to be misunderstood. I was not making this comparison. I was just saying that it occurred to me that the way to go about it is in a diagnostic way. That's what I meant by AIDS. I meant that you went about solving the problem through diagnosis, through kind of a scientific kind of inquiry into this, right? And that's what I suggest that one begins to do. So I don't notice schools, that study political science and that have a phenomenon which is as extraordinary as the phenomenon of the persistence of anti-Semitism in modern times. And it isn't really subjected to the same kind of scrutiny. So your point about differentiation, I take very seriously, and I really want to make that point. I've tried to differentiate anti-Semitism from other forms of hatred, discrimination, and so on and so forth. As far as, you know, I have gone against my own principles in a way, because one of the things that I would suggest to everyone, if you are talking about Israel, the Middle East, or anything which is going to involve Israel in the Middle East, you do not have the discussion without a full-scale map of the Middle East. Not a map of Israel. And you are doing the same thing. Well, you know, I'm not going to start talking to you about Israel and how it treats Ethiopians, and this is a problem within Israeli society, which it is solving, it seems to me, as well as any other society is solving. Excuse me. But what I do want to know is, what about that map of the Middle East? Why are you not asking about these questions?
I don't disagree with you on that, actually. I think it's a valid point. But then what about looking...
This is the subject of this...
If we're speaking about anti-Semitism, how about looking at the contemporary face of Israel and looking at what's happening with Ethiopian Jews, for instance, and who consider themselves to be Jewish and Semitic? How would you include that case study into your inquiry about anti-Semitism? Would you acknowledge that there's something odd about fellow Semites treating other Semites poorly, you know?
Why don't you? Yes, okay, look.
Would you at least be
I would
willing
like to see
it?
another country that has gone, as the Israelis have done, into Ethiopia, into India, to bring out the people who called themselves Jews, to bring them to the country, to try to integrate them into the country. I'd like to find another example. America...
That doesn't answer the question, though,
okay,
really. It doesn't answer the question. It doesn't excuse
I will not,
certain,
excuse me, my subject of anti-Semitism is I will not make Israel the subject. The subject is the organization of politics against Israel. That is my subject. Internal Israeli politics is my problem as a Jew, your problem as a Jew or a non-Jew, whatever you want. That's different. Anti-Semitism is a huge entity, and I will not deflect from that thing to any other internal issue. Of course Israel has problems. It's a democracy. It'll have problems that maybe, as you said, the worst country. That does not change the question of it's not being attacked for how bad it is. It's being attacked for how good it is.
I think that's a great exchange to end on. Thank you so much. And thank you all. You were really, really great. Thank you.
Can I actually just... we have one more question on this side, if you'd be willing. There's one more question on this side, if you'd be willing.
Thank you all. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9:30. I wish you all.
And now we're leaving the twilight zone of Planet Likud.